scientific story of World War I, the Great War, as it was known at the time. See, we don't call it World War I until World War II. Unfortunately, we had to have another World War. But the Great War, and it's a, as I get into it, you're going to see that this is a brief moment. The camaraderie and the humanity that emerges across the trenches between opposing sides that ideologically and according to their governments despise each other, and yet they have a moment of peace. Betsy, you're going to be
I certainly will.
Johnny on the spot here with the slides. This is, I just bring this one up first. It's an idealized depiction. Shortly, the Christmas Truce itself, it's not just on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, as I'll point out, in the sectors where it occurred, and it's not all across the front. It's really confined to the part of the Western Front where the British are facing the Germans, and the French are somewhat involved as well. But it starts probably about a week before Christmas. You start having a few instances of ceasefire and coming across the lines and wishing good tidings, and then it'll continue on close to the New Year. So in fits and starts, sporadically, over about a 10-day period, you have the Christmas Truce. So it's not a single day. But the news did filter back home. The British covered it probably more closely than any of the other countries. And this is from the Illustrated London News. Not too long afterward, it's a painting, a drawing, idealized version of a German carrying a little Tannenbaum across the lines. We'll see some real photographs to give you a more realistic idea of what's going on. Hit the next slide here. Just a kind of a prelude or some background information to the Great War. Why are we having this Christmas truce in the first place? Well, it's because Europe has descended into military conflagration. And I'm not going to give you a whole story on why World War I happened. This is one of these great topics that historians of the subject still wrestle with today. There's no clear-cut reason. It's a difficult war sometimes to understand because there's no real clear-cut bad guy. World War II is a lot easier when you got a person like Adolf Hitler, who you can point at as a fiend and a villain. We're fighting evil with his final solution and the Nazis. World War I, a little more complicated. The imperialisms, all of these are just, all of these factor in one form or another. I should have probably put as a bullet, the actual trigger event is when the Archduke Francis Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, no longer in existence, is assassinated by a Serbian, and then that sets in motion a chain of events that propels Europe into war. But the imperialism and nationalism go together. Again, I'm not trying to insult anyone's intelligence here, but we have Germany on one side. They're the principal instigator of the military conflict, and they have an ally, Austria-Hungary, now divided into a number of countries today, and they're fighting against France and Russia and Great Britain. And that's part of an alliance system, pretty inflexible alliance system, where the two sides have strong requirements that if one is attacked, they're all supposed to participate in the conflict. And then some military plans that all of the countries devise in this ever-growing competition against one another. In the course of World War I, the generals really take over the running of the war in all the countries involved to a great extent. And they've all got fairly inflexible military plans that once the governments give the go according to the alliance systems, the military takes over and executes the plans, because there's a concern if you don't strike first, you're going to lose. And this little bit down here, I've got this very simple mathematical equation. It's unlike math where 2 + 2 = 4. Industry plus science doesn't always equal technological slaughter. Sometimes it can land us on the moon, for instance, something impressive and worth celebrating. But in the context of World War I, the industrial capacities of the countries involved and the scientific advances is going to lead to a number of weapons systems that just produce horrific slaughter on the battlefield. Artillery and machine guns and rifles are pretty standard, but as the war unfolds, poison gas is going to be brought in, flamethrowers, barbed wire will be pretty common. Rebar incident, you don't even think that's the iron bars that you put in concrete to give them greater structural stability. That's actually it. The Germans introduced that as part of the trench system, and then everybody copies that in order to strengthen the trench system. So airplanes, U-boats, tanks. World War I is a pioneering conflict for lots of weapons of not so much mass destruction, but quite a bit of big destruction all the same. And Britain and Germany in particular are probably, other than the United States, are the most industrial advanced countries in the world. France a little bit less so. Russia kind of struggling in the area of industry, but Germany, not just their industry, but the Farben Chemical Company, they're going to be at the forefront of chlorine gas, phosgene gas, mustard gas. The Farben Company had a near global monopoly over dyes, D-Y-E, and then they shift to poison gas in service of their country to make the World War I even more disgusting than it already is. We get the next one here, Betsy, moving along with the larger historical context of the calm moment that you're all looking forward to. This is one of those military plans, probably the most famous of the military plans that comes out of World War I, the Schlieffen Plan, which was the German military's grand strategy for prevailing in a conflict should it erupt, as it did in the summer of 1914. It's named after a German general who was dead by the time World War I started, but had been working on this for the years prior to. Germany, here, this is just focusing on the area that I'm going to be talking about today, but Germany found itself in a two-front war. Russia's way over here, and in the alliance system, if war broke out, Germany knew that they would be fighting France and Russia simultaneously, possibly Britain coming in. They were hoping the British might stay out, but the British had said, if you go into Belgium, we'll come in. Germans go into Belgium, Brits come in. So they anticipated all of this, and the Schlieffen Plan was a grand strategy, very bold, very ambitious, very complicated, ultimately very impractical, of trying to cold-cock the French seen as the greater threat in order to then shift everything to defeat the Russians, whom the Germans assumed would mobilize much more slowly because they had an inept government and not very advanced. A lot of assumptions about what the Russians were capable of doing. Anyway, and the Germans trigger the conflict first. Once it's clear war is going to begin, the Schlieffen Plan. And the French component, or the Western component of the Schlieffen Plan, you see all these armies, and this is actually one of the simplest maps I could find to show what's going on here. 80% of the German army is committed to taking out France. They've got a shoestring defense in the east, hoping to fend off the Russians long enough to take out the French. And the 80% comes to about just under 2 million men that the Germans have mustered. It's weighted heavily on the northern flank, and as these arrows suggest, this is the ideal. This is what they're hoping to do is steamroll through Belgium, which will then bring Belgium into the war. The Belgians aren't particularly thrilled, and they join the French and the British as fighters. And then they swing around Paris and somehow engulf the French army in this massive turning movement, hoping that the German military can crush it before the British really can come across the channel in any significant strength. And that's the plan. As it begins, we're working our way toward this Christmas truce. This all breaks out in August 1914. This massive German juggernaut is unleashed. The French are frantically mobilizing. The British are beginning to deploy troops across the channel. Fierce fighting all along this frontier. All these armies are heavily engaged, and I'm going to give you some casualty figures here in just a moment. We always think of World War I as a trench war, and it does become that. This is the war of movement, the first 5 months. Just because you're moving doesn't mean you can't get hit and killed as well. Artillery does a lot of damage. I'm always a little disappointed when I watch war movies. I always watch them with a historian's eye. And not that my wife likes to watch a lot of war movies, but she really doesn't like to watch them when I'm there because I have lots of critical comments to make, and she's like, "Can't we just watch the movie?" Because artillery is never properly displayed in Hollywood. Hollywood just can't capture the thunderous, destructive power of an artillery barrage. Because the camera, you got to have everybody close so the movie star can be seen. And you see these little explosions on the ground, when you're firing these massive multi-inch caliber artillery rounds with 50 to 150 yard blast radius, you are inflicting massive casualties. And these are close, compact forces moving. You got 2 million guys condensed in this area for the Germans. Just under 2 million for the French. The British are going to bring 100,000 men in. That number will grow. All of this climaxes at the Marne. You may be familiar with the Great Battle of the Marne. The Germans end up having to constrict their advance. This is part of the complexity of the plan, is the Germans, despite all of their meticulous planning, don't quite take into account the terrain, because these are foot soldiers and horse-drawn supplies. The German train system only goes up to the border. Strategically, they can rapidly deploy, but once they get in motion, most of the supplies are carried by wagons. There's about 700,000 German horses accompanying the nearly 2 million German soldiers, and they're getting killed too. Hollywood doesn't like to show the animals getting blasted to pieces, but there's horse and cattle carcasses all over the battlefield as well. But they're having to constrict the terrain, the resistance. Heaven forbid that the British and the French and the Belgians actually fight back with ferocity, and then just exhaustion. The German timetable is moving. You got to move fast. Speed's important, and guys marching can only go so far while they're fighting under duress. And so the Germans end up canceling this part of the swing, and they keep condensing it until instead of hitting Paris, they strike the French and British forces. Down here at the First March, and that becomes the great battle where the French are able to finally stem the German advance. One of their general, Joffre, was their gruff commander, who basically told his French forces, no more retreating anymore, and any commander who refuses to attack is fired on the spot. Joffre probably went through about 24 brigade and division commanders, because if they showed the slightest nervousness or hesitation in the crisis, he said, "Get the hell out of here. Paris is online, is in jeopardy. Everyone has to fight and resist." So the German attack is stymied. At this point, with the Germans exhausted, not that the Anglo-French forces aren't exhausted as well, both sides are trying to figure out how to consolidate their gains, and you get what's called the race to the sea, where the Allies try to get around the Germans, and that's what this battle here. Then the Germans come around this way, and the British and French, and you get this race to the sea all the way to the Channel. And this is where the trench line is going to develop. Hit the next slide, because I wanted to say something about the human cost of all of this. This is one of the more famous photographs of German infantrymen in the hot summer of 1914 moving through Belgium. And they got the famous Pickelhaube helmet here, which will never be seen again after 1914 because it's not a particularly protective piece of headgear for artillery shrapnel. It's really just a piece of hardened leather, and the ears are exposed. It kind of fits. I guess it looks imperial, but it's actually kind of a dorky looking helmet. Right down to it. Anyway, while we're having some chuckles here, let's not neglect that horrifying number. The numbers I'm going to show you are really, even as many times as I've looked at World War I or other military conflicts, that's just a mind-boggling number. That's killed in action. You can nearly triple that number for wounded. So you've got 240, and this is the first 5 months of World War I. This isn't World War I in general. This is the first 5 months. Right as we're getting to the Christmas Truce, nearly 250,000 Germans are dead in the fighting. And the other ones that were advancing, they're getting killed just as heavily as the others. And there's part of me, when I look at a photograph like this, I'm like, how many of these guys are in that statistic right there on Christmas Eve? Not that the other, you hit the next slide, the French take it even harder on the nose. There's a photograph of French infantrymen moving into battle. 306,000 dead. Again, just the first 5 months of the war. The whole war in total, over 2 million German soldiers will die. The French have about 1.4 million dead. All these numbers are going to escalate. But this is one of the heroic images of the French with fixed bayonets moving to repulse the Germans, who respond with artillery and machine guns. And this is part of the open field. But the French, they've been invaded, but they don't want to defend, they want to attack. Their commanders, Joffre, I just mentioned him, had the spirit of the offensive, and that meant fixed bayonets and drive the Boche out. B-O-C-E-H, the Boche, the German, kind of the French version for, it's like literally it means cabbage head, but blockhead. It's an insulting term for the Germans. The British are a little more, they refer to the Germans as Jerry or Fritz. The French, as we'll see, have a great deal more contempt for the Germans. And this goes back way before the war. There was nationalistic hostility between the Germans and the French, which produced the ferocity of the fighting. But again, a mind-boggling number, just in 5 months. And collectively, as I'm a Civil War historian by training, that's where I do most of my research. In the first 5 months of World War I, there were more collective men killed in action than in the entire American Civil War, which is the bloodiest war in American history. And yet you could put the American Civil War into the first 5 months of World War I, and you still got almost 4 years of combat in World War I together. But there's our valiant French. Before you turn, and I do mean that, valiant French. That sometimes some of our pundits and politicians have of late made the French military a punchline. That I think comes out of World War II, where they were so quickly conquered by the Germans again, using blitzkrieg tactics. But the French of World War I, there was a truly heroic quality to their defense of their homeland, and the Germans do not prevail against them. Next slide here, Betsy. I don't want to leave the British out of this. They're going to get bloodied as well. Not to the same extent in the first 5 months, because the British Expeditionary Force rapidly deploys. It's about 4 to 6 divisions that end up coming across. It's about 100,000 will participate in the first 5 months of the fighting, but 30% of those guys are dead, and about 60,000 wounded. The British Expeditionary Force, in which these gentlemen are an element, including the Scotsman here, wearing yet another piece of apparel perfectly suited for World War I style fighting, the kilt. These are outstanding soldiers. The British Expeditionary Force was renowned for its professionalism, discipline, marksmanship, but it was very small, and most of it was destroyed in the first 5 months of World War I. After the Christmas Truce, the governments are going to keep fighting, and they're going to engage in mass mobilization through conscription to get the requisite soldiers onto the battlefield to offset the losses that ensued in the first 5 months. Missing a point here. But yeah, the old Scotsman there. Go back to the main map if you could. Back, okay. Ooh. Yeah, that was quick. I was thinking we were going to have some confusion there, but you did quite well. With the trench system unfolds here, and we're going to increasingly narrow the focus to Flanders, in Flanders Field, a British expression, because this is where the British Army will largely be concentrated. Once you get into the trench system, the French have the obligation of protecting the bulk of the front, but it is their country, after all, that they're trying to defend. And the British concentrated in Flanders and Artois, this area here. It's also close to the channel, where they can get quick supplies or a quick getaway if things get out of hand. That'll be the focus. And we can now go forward to the slide after the British. Yeah. This is that line, the trench system that I pointed out. And this is now we're getting some depictions of what it looked like. By the Christmas season of 1914, the war of movement gives way to a war of static defense, where both sides, because of the killing power of artillery and machine guns, are digging into the earth and trying to consolidate their positions. The Germans are trying to hold what they've taken, and the French and the British are trying to get into the position where the Germans can no longer advance and hopefully have a staging area to drive them out. But we've got these are just some shot. This is a French trench down here, French soldiers. This is a British trench with, of course, one of these British officers displaying the typical aplomb of the officer corps, unfazed by the danger. I don't know how long this guy lasts, but he's looking quite dapper there with his pipe in hand. Then the Germans are over here in their position. And look, you can see these are very rudimentary trenches. These because it's just started. Both sides are beginning to dig into the earth, and you basically just dig a trough. That's step one in laying out your trench line. These will increase after the Christmas Truce, 1915 and on. These will become increasingly sophisticated fortifications, where you're going to have multiple trenches, defense in depth, with interconnecting trenches. You'll zigzag the trench, and won't be lines like this, but you'll have them go in zigzag formation, so that if the enemy breaches and gets into a trench, then you can't just shoot down the line. You can inflict even greater casualties. It makes it more difficult. You'll have barbed wire out front. You'll have overhead cover, those concrete bunkers I talked about with the rebar for machine gun positions. You'll dig deeper into the earth and create barracks where the soldiers can rest and sleep, and then after the artillery barrage has signaled a forthcoming enemy attack, they can rise up, man the position. These become incredibly sophisticated defensive systems. Science and industry coming together to create an elaborate defensive system that human flesh is then ordered to break through by governments and generals who are astonishingly obtuse about the killing power, but are determined to see this war through to a victory. And while one would say, look at those casualties that I just showed you, and said, this is madness. This needs to stop. Somebody needs to stop this. Oddly enough, when I look at military history, the more casualties you sustain, as long as you have the capacity to keep fighting, you will keep fighting in order to at least justify the sacrifice of those who came before in the hopes of finally winning something. So the deeper you get into the war, the less likely it is you to extract yourself from it short of victory. And both sides are determined. Both sides have tremendous capacity to absorb losses and keep this conflict going. There are some neutral powers that try to bring some sense to the war. Pope Benedict XV, the Pope at the time, issued a call for a ceasefire, that these were Christian nations fighting, and that there was hardly any Christian spirit on display here, and it was time to put an end to it. The Pope was ignored by the governments involved. They were like, that's a fine sentiment, and you be quiet, go back to the Vatican, and we have real business to conduct here in the trenches. Even Woodrow Wilson in the United States tried to persuade the Allied powers. He said, you need to have peace without victory, was his refrain. The United States will eventually get involved, but initially Wilson was trying to talk some sense into these combatants. Peace without victory. But again, that expression was unacceptable to nationalistically driven governments like Germany and France. Peace without victory? Are you kidding me? Not after we've had 250,000 people just die. We're going to win this thing, and vice versa. Oh, notice the headgear. I talked about that before, the pickle house. These are kepis, or caps. After 1914, steel helmets will be standard gear. Nobody dresses like that. That offers no protection. No protection. Next slide. You recall when you've got these trench troughs as you head into the autumn, as you head on toward Christmas Eve. It's a very, very cold and rainy season, especially cold and especially rainy, and you get these floods. The trenches are going to fill with water. That one German position I showed was right next to a river. I'm not even sure how they managed to keep the water out from whether it was raining or not. Water would come in. But the term trench foot emerges because you spend days on end with your feet immersed in. You can't leave the position. You never know when the enemy might attack, so everybody's got to stay in the line. And you got to sleep in this, eat in this. This is your dwelling as well as your defensive position. The text I read point out that it was an especially rainy autumn. Mother Nature has a cruel sense of humor when it comes to war. I don't know how many military campaigns I've read where it will say that it was the hottest summer in the last decade, or it was the coldest winter. 1913, 1912, those were considered pleasant autumn seasons. Light rain, good weather. Then the war breaks out, and of course, we're going to get lots and lots of rain. Why not? You're not just going to fight the enemy, you're going to fight the elements as well. But on Christmas Eve, or about a week before, a cold front came in, the ground hardened, snow began to fall, and you had more of that kind of idyllic Christmas feel. And the next slide. This takes us to Flanders Field. I showed you on the map on the extreme left or western edge of the trench line was Flanders, which is where the British were located, and it's where the most of all this calm that you're going to see, the first-hand accounts, they almost all come from Flanders Field. This is from the Daily Mirror, another British newspaper. You can't see the date, but it's the 8th of January, not too far removed from the Illustrated London News. Again, the British cover this more closely. This is an actual photograph of German and British soldiers coming together in a spirit of camaraderie, a welcome moment of fraternization. And when you set aside the hostilities and you come across, and while that first idealized depiction I showed you of the guy coming out with the tandem bomb, it's really just some Germans coming out unarmed, and a lot of the Germans, they speak English, so there's the communication between the Germans and the British is better than between the Germans and the French. Although a lot of Germans speak French too. They just don't like the French all that much, and vice versa. But you start in fits and starts getting these ceasefire moments. Both sides are exhausted. It's cold. It's miserable. It's also Christmas. Can we set aside? And there's an exchange of a lot of foodstuffs and schnapps and plum puddings and pfeffernusse and all sorts of goodies that care packages that come from home or shared. The Germans especially wanted to get a hold of British newspapers, not necessarily this issue, but they because many of them can speak English. The German soldier at the front was not receiving a lot of news. All that stuff, nationalism, and that I talked about, that's the government and the high leaders of the countries. The common soldiers, they may be patriotic, but they're not imbued with all the military plans and alliance systems. They're the ones that have to carry out these orders. But the Germans especially wanted to know what was going on. German newspapers, when they got them, were heavily censored. The British newspapers, at least for the first part of the war, were a little more candid, a little more freedom of the press, a little more critical, showing instances of fraternization. By 1915, the British government's going to move in and say, no, you don't get, we will tell you what you get to print. Censorship becomes pretty standard. But you've got this moment. There's also, this is not far from this scene, both sides called a ceasefire to bury their dead. There were hundreds of corpses lying between the no man's land, usually like 100 yards of land between the trenches. They were really close together, the enemy trenches. You can see, you can talk to each other. Snipers had a field day, prowling the trench line. But they were burying their dead. They sang Christmas carols. Stille Nacht, Silent Night, was one the Germans initiated. They also then sang Die Wacht am Rhein, which is Watch on the Rhine, a little more patriotic. Anti-French flourish to it, but the British didn't mind that one. Nothing against them. that occurred between a Saxon unit and a British unit. And according to the records, the Germans won 3-2, although the British claim that the winning shot went wide of the Balmoral cap, the Scottish headgear that was used as one of the goalposts in the German. But you're going to go back to war over that? I mean, the government's already going to make you go back to war. All right, the Germans won, the Saxons, you got it. Yeah, you won the thing. Good for you. I will say, that while the Germans and the British are involved, the French, to a lesser extent, are involved. You don't really see very many photographs of any French. Flanders Field on the right flank, the French are in the Artois region, Picardy region. They do, in smaller doses, engage in the Christmas Truce. They're a little more hesitant and suspicious, and they also have a great deal more enmity toward the Germans. And they've just lost 300,000 people. They're not in the most festive mood to share a glass of alcohol with the enemy. They do, some of them do, most of them don't. In fact, other parts of the front, we could go back to that map, but if you go further to the west in Champagne and Lorraine, the French actually conduct offensive operations on Christmas Day, attacking it. Other parts of the front, ferocious fighting is going on. People are dying. This Yuletide is restricted to the area around Flanders. And it's mostly enlisted men and junior officers. The higher up the chain of command you go, the more wary and disapproving the officer corps will be. And toward the end, I'll point out that once it finally gets up to the level of generals and politicians, this nonsense has to come to an end. But it's your privates, your sergeants, your lieutenants, the ones that are actually out there fighting and dying and living in this muck, that say, "Come on, can we be friends?" One German actually said, that the British said, "You're ethnically pretty much the same as we are. You're Germanic. We're Germans. We're Saxons. You're Anglo-Saxon. Why do we keep this going?" The next slide. This is one of these idealized images. Angus McBrian, a Scotsman, painted this in 1969, way after the war, but it shows the enduring appeal of this idea. When you look back on World War I and you think, has the world gone mad? It's reassuring to have that fleeting moment of humanity. And this is, of course, far more idealistic than it really was. There's the soccer game going on here, Germans, and their uniforms look immaculate, by the way. And they're happily sharing drinks and pleasant conversations. Little, what's the word? Mistletoe in the caps. Just a good old time. World War I's not so bad after all. So the next picture here shows that's the closest I could find to something that replicated that painting. This is an actual event. You'll notice the date, the 19th of December. This was a British photograph. So it shows you, it's before Christmas Day, but the Christmas season. And you've got Germans mostly on this side and British mostly on that side, milling about, fraternizing, talking to each other. And then this will go on and sporadically, right up pretty close to the new year. And this is arguably, according to some of the scholars I looked at, this might actually be the first instance of the Christmas Truce, right here. And then others would follow. Those other photographs I showed are later. Those are on Christmas Day photographs. The one from the Daily Mirror and the collage that I showed you. The next slide here, getting close to the end. This sort of thing, you can't keep going on. Headquarters is the Real Scrooge in the story. This is General John French, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, looking about as gruff as he could possibly be. And you can see here, in early January, when he heard all this was going on, I issued immediate orders to prevent any recurrence of such conduct and called the local commanders to strict account. Such unwarlike activity must cease. We're here to win a war, gentlemen. We cannot sip schnapps and eat plum pudding. the next slide here. And so the two sides would go back at it. The Christmas truce would never happen again, at least not until after the war was all completed. And it was, again, isolated to the Flanders area. Elsewhere on the Western Front fighting, and there's almost there's some indication that maybe the tiny bit happened on the Eastern Front, a front that, if we don't know much about World War I, we know even less about what was going on the Eastern Front with the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians fighting each other. But there's very little indication there was any kind of Christmas truce on the Eastern Front. Units would celebrate Christmas in the confines of their own trench. They didn't fraternize with the enemy. And so, to go back to the title of my piece here, we've got Jerome K. Jerome, who was a middle-aged British civilian who served in the ambulance corps. He wanted to fight in the infantry, but he was considered too old, so he's instead removing the dead and the wounded, his service. He said, "Do not let us lose our common humanity in the struggle," referring to this war. That were the worst defeat of all, to come out of this thing without remembering that we're all men, women, children. But the governments would take a number of years to figure that out. And then these are the images that we think more about World War I. 2 years later, the gruesome Battle of Verdun. Both sides, you got these guys in gas masks now. The machine guns preparing for an assault, German hand grenade. These are British troops at the Somme. Both of these conflicts were happening almost simultaneously, and each individually would account for about 1 million casualties combined on both sides. So Verdun and Somme is the apex of World War I in terms of slaughter. Almost 2 million casualties, killed, wounded, and captured in the whole process. A conflict with the Christmas truce. Such a distant memory, in fact, that for many years afterwards, some people thought it was a myth. Somebody made it up. It never really happened, the Christmas truce. But there are letters, there's the diaries, there's newspaper accounts, there's photographs. It did happen, however fleeting, however bizarre, however localized, it was real. We go to the last slide here. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's a lot of material on the Christmas truce, but there's a full-blown book by Stanley Weintraub, Silent Night, about a couple hundred pages. It's with a lot of photographs in it. And then a movie you might be familiar with, Joyeux Noël. I can't remember when it came out, but it's
2005.
2005. You've seen it, obviously. You know the date if you hadn't watched it.
Let me check.
Okay, I verify that. But that's a movie depiction. And then we've got there's a Scotsman here, a German officer, a French. Now the movie shows a little more comity, comity, between the opposing sides. You can almost put a line between the German and the German and the Brit and the French, because they're part of it. But the French really like the Germans. Yeah, for good reason. They've got a troubled history across that border. But that's the fleeting moment, the Christmas truce. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any. Yes, sir.
One of the dates was December 19th.
Yes.
Was it 24 hours, or did it last until Christmas?
It went on. There's that day, and then they went back to their trenches. There wasn't a lot of fighting, even if they weren't out fraternizing. There was a kind of a tacit understanding they were just not going to shoot at each other. So there was we talk about Silent Night. That song. There was a calm. There'd be some sniper fire, some patrols. Every now and then, some officers would say, "Get out there and do something." But it persisted. Even if they weren't fraternizing, they were just standing down. It was cold. It was miserable. They're tired, and the higher headquarters hasn't quite grasped that the soldiers aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's going to take a while for a guy like John French to catch up and say, "Okay, get serious again." Is there Dr. Henderson?
I think I've read somewhere that there were attempts by rank and file soldiers in subsequent years to sort of reprise the Christmas truce. It maybe didn't amount to much because it was discouraged by higher ups. But do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there were some efforts. In 1915, some talk, but the high command, the headquarters of both sides were more cognizant of this possibility and anticipated it, and it was considered defeatist. And there were soldiers that were arrested or briefly thrown in the brig, so to speak, as we're not doing that again. It did not happen. Certainly not to this scale. I can't say with certainty that there wasn't for 10 minutes, a couple of guys came across and swapped some stuff and said, "Remember 1914?" Although I can't imagine many of them. Most of the guys from in 1918, there was a British unit, the 106th Cheshire Infantry, which had participated in the first Silent Night, or the first Christmas Truce. When in 1918, when they finally cleared Flanders field, one of the soldiers recalled, "This is where the Christmas Truce happened." He was not a participant there, but he remembered this is where it happened. And there's a lot of speculation from a regimental history of the 106th that is hard-pressed to find anyone still in the 106th that was still alive or in uniform that had participated in the Christmas Truce. They were either dead or wounded or had been mustered out for some reason. So there was nobody in that same regiment 4 years later that had actually participated in that Christmas Truce, even though that unit had participated in it. The soldiers, because that's the turnover. That shows you how much turnover.
What about from the other sides?
What's that?
What about the Germans?
Probably the same. There's the letters, the journals. Those that were wounded, they could remember. There are survivors who could say, "Yeah, I was there at the Christmas Truce. It was real." But by the time the war came to an end, there was very few participants in the Christmas Truce that were still in the field, in the uniform.
As a follow-up to that, do you know if there was ever any reunion after the war?
That's a great question. I don't know. That's a great question, though. If there was a reunion, I thought I almost put it in as an image. In Flanders Field, there is a statue. Many years, a memorial. Many years afterward, it's got I guess a bronze statue of a German and a British soldier shaking hands, and then there's a soccer ball between the two of them, and it's in Flanders. But that's a great question. If there was any reunions.
Another question.
Okay, keep them coming.
During the truce, were any of the civilians from the local towns participate, like bring out food or drink to the soldiers?
Not that I'm aware of. No. If there were any civilians, most of them were cleared out because this whole area is turned into a war zone. The civilians are refugees who've been moved out. And if there would have been any, they would have probably been French civilians who would have been very probably unwilling to share their goodies with the Germans. That 306,000 dead and then 1.4 million at the end, and this is not hyperbole. There was not a single family in France that did not have a father, a brother, a son, a close male relative, cousin, uncle that was not killed or wounded in World War I. Every family was touched directly by that war. When I think about the United States is at war in the Middle East, our government's at war, our society is not. There are very few American families that have felt the personal loss of whatever we're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have lost maybe 7,000 U.S. service personnel, which is an unfortunate number, but it's a tiny fraction of the American population. Imagine if every one of you in this room could name a father, a brother, a son, a husband who had been killed or maimed in the Middle East. That'd be a much different outlook on the conflict. This is a searing event, a whole war in European history. And it's, again, mind-boggling. We can look at it rationally, but it's the world gone crazy. Other thoughts, questions, comments?
So in Flanders Field, are the dead from both sides of the war buried there?
Yeah, there are numerous graveyards, which are works of art in and of themselves, all across northern France, from all of the battles. And many of the remains are unidentified. I think that's where the unknown soldier concept comes out of World War I. Tombs of the unknown soldier. Not just the United States isn't the only country with one. The British have a tomb of the unknown soldier. I imagine France and Germany does as well. But yeah, the very elaborate, beautiful, touching, solemn graveyards across Belgium and northern France. Yes, sir.
You seem so knowledgeable. I'm just wondering how.
I'm a good con man.
I'm just wondering-
About 40% of what I said is right.
I just wondered how you personally got interested in this.
Well, like I said, I started off as a Civil War historian. I grew up in a military family. My dad was career Navy, and then I went into the Army. As a little kid, I've always liked toy soldiers and G.I. Joes and war movies, and go through books and look at the pictures until I could learn how to read. It's just it's just a personal oddity to me. And then but I'm very fortunate that as an adult, I'm now able to earn a living, continuing to study and look at these things and share my insights. So yeah, since I was a little kid. Here's a little anecdote. My parents, I think I was maybe like 3 or 4. I don't remember much of it, but my family recalls it. He had a piñata of one of my siblings' birthdays filled with candy and coins and toy soldiers. And every time it got blasted open and everything would come out, I and my siblings would scramble on the ground. I grabbed the toy soldiers and stacked them up. Well, my sister grabbed the money and my brother grabbed the candy. But I always feel like I got the better deal out of it.